He grabbed her wrist so hard she dropped the ladle. The soup hit the dirt. 2 days' worth of rationed beans, gone. And Cole Briggs just laughed, a slow, ugly sound that made every man around the fire look away. "Clean it up, widow woman," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's all you're good for anyway." Lenora Ashby was 20 years old. She had buried her husband 4 months ago, watched her savings disappear in 3, and taken this job because there was no other option left. She was not supposed to be here, on this brutal trail, surrounded by men who treated her like furniture. She was supposed to be invisible, but Gideon Mercer, the trail boss, heard every word from across the camp, and something shifted behind his eyes, something no one around that fire was expecting. If that were you, 20 years old, alone, and just trying to survive, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, stories about ordinary people pushed to their absolute limits, please subscribe to this channel right now. Every week, we bring you powerful, emotional stories that will stay with you long after the video ends. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning Lenora Ashby accepted the job, she had exactly $4.32 to her name. She counted it twice, standing at the kitchen table of the boarding house where she rented a room by the week. A small, cold room with a window that didn't fully close and a landlady who had started leaving notes under the door about overdue rent. The coins sat in a neat line on the scratched wood surface, and she stared at them the way a person stares at something they already know isn't enough. Thomas had been gone 4 months. Thomas Ashby, who was 23 years old and had coughed his way through their entire first winter of marriage and died in February before the ground thawed enough to bury him properly. They had been married 11 months. She had known him for 14. He was kind and not particularly strong, and he had loved her genuinely, which she knew even then was not something to take lightly. But kindness didn't pay the rent, and the small amount of savings he'd left behind had gone to the doctor bills, then the funeral, then the first 2 months of rent while she tried to figure out what came next. What came next was this: a hand-lettered notice pinned to the post outside the general store. Cook wanted, cattle drive, Wichita to Billings, Montana. 3 months, wages paid on arrival. Inquire at McCready Stockyard before Friday. She had read it 3 times. She had walked away. She had come back the next morning before the sun was fully up and read it a 4th time, and then she had gone to the stockyard and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. The man who came out to meet her was not Gideon Mercer. It was a heavy-set hiring manager named Poole, who looked her up and down with the kind of expression that made her jaw tighten and said, "We're looking for a cook, ma'am, not a waitress." "I know what you're looking for," she said. "I cooked for my father's farm from age 12 until I married. Before that, I helped in the church kitchen every Sunday from the time I could reach a counter. I know how to feed large numbers of men with limited supplies under difficult conditions. That is what you need." Poole stared at her. "It's a cattle drive. 3 months on the trail, no hotels, no comfort. You'd be the only woman. I understand that. It's not safe." "Mr. Poole," she said, keeping her voice level, "my other option is losing my room by the end of the week. I understand what I'm agreeing to." He hired her for the lack of any better candidate, as she would learn later. The man before her had broken his arm 2 days prior. She was the only person who had responded to the notice. These were facts she was not told at the time, and perhaps it was better that way, because she might have found them discouraging. She packed 1 bag. She gave her landlady the $4.32 and told her to keep the rest of her things if she didn't return. There wasn't much. And she didn't say it to be dramatic. She said it because it was practical, and she was, above almost everything else, a practical woman. The wagon train assembled at the McCready Stockyard on a Tuesday morning in late April, and Lenora arrived early, before most of the crew, and began taking inventory of the supply wagon without being asked. She found the flour situation immediately problematic. 2 of the sacks had gotten damp at some point and were beginning to clump at the bottom. And she was in the middle of assessing the dried meat stores when she heard boots on the ground behind her and turned to find a man watching her from a few feet away. He was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she expected. Tall and broad through the shoulders, maybe 35, with a face that had clearly spent most of its life in weather. He wore the kind of stillness that some men carry naturally, the kind that isn't stillness at all, but rather a long practice of not wasting movement. He had dark eyes and a jaw that needed a shave, and he was looking at her the way a person looks at something unexpected. Not unkindly, but with clear assessment. "You're the cook?" he said. It was not a question. "Lenore Ashby," she said, and stuck out her hand, which seemed to briefly catch him off guard. He shook it. "Gideon Mercer." A pause. "What are you doing with the flour?" "Two of these sacks are compromised. They've been stored somewhere damp. I need to use them first before the rest, or we'll lose them entirely somewhere around week 2. It'll affect the biscuit quality, but it's better than throwing them out." He looked at the sacks. He looked at her. He said, "All right," and walked away. That was their entire first conversation. The crew numbered 17 men, including Gideon. They ranged in age from a boy named Cutter, who might have been 16 and was still growing into his hands, to an older hand named Walt, who had done this trail 4 times before and moved like his knees hurt him in the mornings. Most of them acknowledged her arrival with the particular brand of silence that men use when they have decided someone doesn't quite belong. A couple of them nodded. One or two looked her over with expressions she recognized and chose not to dignify with a reaction. And then there was Cole Briggs. Cole Briggs was 31 years old and had been on cattle drive since he was 18, and he had the particular confidence that comes from being good at something and knowing everyone around you knows it. He was a genuinely skilled cowhand. She would come to understand that over the following weeks. But his skill had curdled somewhere along the way into the belief that it entitled him to treat the people below him on the hierarchy however he felt like treating them. He sized Lenora up in the first 5 minutes, came to a conclusion, and acted on it. "You're going to want to stay out of the way," he told her, leaning against the supply wagon while she was still taking inventory. Not offering it as advice. Offering it as a command. "Trail's no place for a woman who doesn't know what she's doing." She kept counting the tins. "I'll keep that in mind. I'm serious. Last thing we need is somebody slowing us down." She looked up then. "Are you the trail boss?" A pause. "No." "Then I'll take my instructions from the trail boss," she said, and went back to her counting. It was in retrospect probably not the wisest response. But she had buried her husband and lost her savings and been spoken to by a lot of men who thought her circumstances made her someone who could be addressed in that particular way, and she had run out of the inclination to pretend it was acceptable. Cole Briggs did not forget it. The first week of this drive was, in the bluntest possible terms, a brutal education. Lenora had cooked for farmhands, and she had cooked in quantity, and she thought she understood hard work, but cooking on a moving cattle drive was a different thing entirely. Cooking over an open fire and wind that didn't cooperate, with pots that were never quite level, in whatever time she had between the camp being made and the men needing to eat, which was usually less time than required. She burned her right hand twice in the first 3 days. The second time was bad enough that she wrapped it in cloth torn from her spare shirt and kept working because there was no alternative. Nobody noticed, or if they noticed, nobody said anything. She hadn't expected them to. What she noticed and filed carefully away was Gideon Mercer, the way he ran the drive, efficiently, without drama, through clear instruction and consistent expectation. He didn't raise his voice unless he needed to, and when he did, it was precise, not reactive. He kept the crew moving at a pace that was demanding without being punishing, and when there were decisions to be made, he made them quickly and then moved on. She had grown up around men who led things. Her father had managed a farm, and she had watched him navigate disputes and hard seasons and the particular difficulty of keeping a group of people working toward the same goal. And she recognized in Gideon the same quality her father had, which was that his authority came from his competence rather than his volume. He checked on the supply wagon twice a day. Not hovering, not interfering, just a brief inventory of where things stood, a word or two with her about what was running low or what needed to be prioritized. He treated her, she realized slowly, the same way he treated the other hands. He gave her the information she needed, expected her to handle her role, and moved on. There was nothing patronizing in it and nothing pointed. It was simply professional regard, and she found it, unexpectedly, to be the most comfortable she'd felt around any of the men on the trail. On the 8th day, she ran out of coffee. This was a crisis. She knew it would be before it happened, had been calculating the supplies against the consumption rate for days, and the math had been ungenerous. She had stretched it as far as she could, watered it down incrementally, used the grounds twice when she could get away with it. But on the morning of the 8th day, the tin was empty. She set out plain hot water on the fire. The reaction from the crew was exactly what she expected. Complaints. Most of them muttered, but some of them not. 2 men asked her directly where the coffee was. She told them it had run out and that she had reported the shortage to the trail boss and was awaiting direction. Awaiting direction, one of them repeated, in the voice people use when they're mocking something. Wonderful. Useless. She did not respond. What she had actually done 2 nights earlier was lay out the consumption numbers for Gideon in clear terms. We are through more than projected. There is not enough to reach the next supply point. Here's where I think the discrepancy is. And he had listened to the whole thing without interrupting her and then said he would see what he could do. The following afternoon, he had come back with a small additional supply of coffee beans acquired from a passing wagon headed the other direction, enough to get them through to Dodge City if they were careful with it. She had been careful with it. They ran out on day 8 instead of day 6. She considered this a partial success. Cole Briggs did not see it that way. He didn't say anything that morning. He took his water without the dramatic incident she had half been bracing for, because the crew was watching, and he was smart enough to know that a scene in front of everyone required a particular kind of backing. He was the kind of man who waited, who let things accumulate. His moment came 3 days later, on an evening when the day had already been bad. A section of the herd had drifted, and it had taken 3 extra hours to bring them back in line, and everyone was tired and irritable when they finally made camp. Lenora had pushed herself to have food ready despite the delay, which meant she had been cooking nearly without stop for an hour and a half in fading light, and when she served the meal, one of the servings was too small. She had miscalculated the portions, had been rushing, had made an error. It was Cole Briggs's plate. She offered immediately to correct it. "I can add to that. I have—" "You always do this," he said, not loudly. That was what made it effective. He said it at conversation volume, so everyone nearby heard it, and it implied that there was a pattern, a history. "Short portions for me specifically, every time." "That's not accurate. I've been watching." He set the plate down deliberately, wondering when someone was going to say something. "Guess it's on me." He looked around at the men nearest to them. "Any of you noticed?" A couple of them shifted, not confirming it, but not denying it either, men who didn't want to get involved, and whose silence he was weaponizing. "I made an error with the portions tonight," Lenora said, keeping her voice steady. "I was cooking in a hurry after a difficult day, and one portion came out short. I have offered to correct it. That is the whole story." "See, that's the problem," Cole said, leaning back now, enjoying himself. He was good at this. Not as explosive as some, but precise. Always got an excuse, always some reason, and I'm just supposed to accept it. She was bringing him the additional serving when it happened. She had gone back to the wagon, added to the plate, was carrying it back, and he reached out and grabbed her wrist as she approached, the way a person grabs a thing rather than a person, sudden and without warning, and the plate tilted and the food hit the ground. "Clumsy," he said, and that was when he said it. "Clean it up, widow woman, that's all you're good for anyway." She felt the words land the way physical things land, in the chest, in the throat. Not because they were surprising, because they were said in front of everyone, deliberately, and with the specific intent to establish, publicly and finally, exactly what he thought she was. Not a cook, not an employee, not a person who had been hired to do a job and was doing it in hard conditions. Just a woman with nothing, who was here because she had no better option, and who should be made to understand that every day. The camp was very quiet. She bent down and began picking up the spilled food from the dirt. Her hand, the burned one, still wrapped, still not fully healed, pressed against the ground, and the pain moved through it sharply, and she kept her face still and kept her hands moving. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision a long time ago, longer ago than 4 months probably. Made it in the particular way you make a decision not consciously, but through accumulated experience, through learning what happened when you showed that kind of weakness to people who were looking for it. She was 3/4 through cleaning it up when she heard footsteps and then Gideon Mercer's voice. "Briggs?" One word. Nothing more. But the quality of it was different from his normal register, stripped of everything, flat and without temperature, which she had already come to understand in the short time she'd spent around him meant something. Cole looked up. "Just having a conversation." "I saw what I saw," Gideon said. "Get up, Mrs. Ashby." She looked up at him. He was not looking at her, so he was looking at Cole with that flat, stripped expression. But his voice, when he said her name, was different. Not warm, exactly, but deliberate, like he was choosing to name her precisely because Briggs had chosen not to. She stood. "Wrist," Gideon said, still not looking at her, his eyes fixed on Cole. She wasn't sure what he meant until she realized she was cradling her right hand against her chest, the way she always did when the pain flared up, without being aware she was doing it. She straightened, lowered her arm. "I'll hear from you if there's a problem with the food preparation," Gideon said to Cole. "You bring it to me. You don't handle it yourself. That's the last time we'll discuss it." Cole's jaw was tight. He held Gideon's gaze for 2 beats longer than was comfortable, and then he looked away, which was not surrender. There was nothing like surrender in the set of his shoulders, but it was compliance, for now, and everyone around the fire saw it. Gideon turned and walked back toward the horses. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not say anything else to her. She watched him go and understood, in the specific way you understand things that don't come with explanations, that this was how he operated, that in his economy what he had just done was substantial, and that she was expected to take it as such without requiring it to be named. She went back to the wagon and started preparing for the next day's food. Her hand hurt. She was tired in a way that had begun to feel foundational rather than temporary. She had not spoken to another woman in 3 weeks. She had not slept on a bed in that long either, and she had been managing on less sleep than was healthy because there was always something that needed doing at the margins of the day before the men woke up and after they went to sleep. She thought briefly about Thomas, about the way he used to reach for her hand in the mornings without waking up fully, a kind of reflexive reaching that she hadn't noticed much at the time, and now thought about more than she expected to. She thought about the boarding house room with the window that didn't close, which had felt like a step down at the time and now seemed, in retrospect, to have contained a certain number of things she'd been taking for granted. Then she put the thought down. You couldn't afford to think about things that weren't here anymore. You could only think about what was in front of you. What was in front of her was 500 miles of open country, 17 men, a supply wagon with 2 compromised flour sacks she was still working through, and a burned right hand that was healing slower than she'd like. She opened the flour sack and began measuring out what she'd need for the morning. Tomorrow would be another day. There were more of them behind her than ahead of her now, which was something. She held on to that. Outside, around the dying fire, the camp settled into sleep. Somewhere in the dark, cattle moved and made their quiet sounds. She could hear the wind picking up from the north, which meant temperature drop before morning, which meant she'd need to account for that in the cooking time. She noted it, filed it, and kept working. The morning after Gideon's intervention, nobody said anything about it. That was how it worked out here. Things happened. They were absorbed into the collective memory of the group, and life continued without the kind of formal acknowledgement that might have occurred in a parlor or a courthouse. Cole Briggs woke up, saddled his horse, and rode out to his position on the flank as if the previous evening had been unremarkable. The other men ate their breakfast. Biscuits made from the last of the compromised flour, which Lenora had managed to salvage reasonably well by adding a little extra lard to compensate for the texture, and dispersed to their duties without meeting her eyes any more or less than usual. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Nothing visible, nothing you could point to, just a different quality to the space around her. Walt, the older hand with the bad knees, brought his tin back to the wagon after breakfast and set it down near the wash water instead of just leaving it on the ground where he'd been sitting, which was what most of them did. He didn't say anything. He just set it down in a place that made her job marginally easier, and then he walked away. She noticed it and didn't comment on it and added it to the small ledger she kept in her head of things that meant something even when they weren't said out loud. The boy, Cutter, had started lingering near the supply wagon in the mornings. He was the youngest on the crew by several years and occupied the lowest rung of the cowhand hierarchy with the particular discomfort of someone who is aware of his position and hasn't yet figured out what to do about it. He didn't talk much, not out of unfriendliness, but out of what seemed like genuine uncertainty about what talking to her was supposed to look like. He would appear near the wagon on some pretense, fiddle with something, and then occasionally say a thing. That morning it was, "Those biscuits were better than yesterday's." She was scrubbing the pot. "Yesterday's were better than the day before." A pause. "I didn't think so." "You ate 4 of them?" "I was hungry." She didn't smile, but it was a near thing. "They'll be better once we're through the compromised flour. Another 2 days, maybe." He nodded seriously, as though this was information he'd needed, and then wandered off to whatever task was waiting for him. She watched him go and thought about how young he was, and hoped this trail was teaching him things that would actually be useful to him later, and not just the kind of hard lessons that left marks without building anything. The terrain had changed over the past week in ways she was still adjusting to. When they'd left Wichita, the land had been relatively familiar, flat, open, recognizable as farmland extended outward. But they were moving now through country that felt different in its bones, emptier and wider, and with a sky that seemed to operate on a larger scale than the sky she'd grown up under. She didn't dislike it exactly, but it had a quality of exposure that she wasn't used to, a sense that there was nothing between you and whatever was coming that might break the wind or slow it down. And on the bad days, the high wind days, the days when the dust came sideways, that exposure felt less like freedom and more like vulnerability. The second bad storm hit on a Thursday. She knew it was coming before it arrived because the cattle knew first, which was something Walt had told her in one of his occasional spare comments, that the herd was better weather prediction than anything man had invented, that you watched them in the late afternoon and they would tell you what the night was going to bring. She'd been watching them for a week by then, learning the difference between the ordinary restlessness of animals that had been moving all day and the specific kind of collective agitation that meant something was coming from the northwest. On Thursday afternoon, the herd told her plainly. She spent the 2 hours before the storm arrived securing everything she could on the supply wagon, lashing down the flour sacks, covering the dried goods, making sure the fire materials were as protected as she could manage. She had done this once already, 2 weeks prior, when a shorter storm had come through and taken a canvas covering and scattered half a day's worth of carefully rationed coffee into the dirt. She was not going to lose anything twice if she could prevent it. Gideon rode past while she was still working and slowed his horse. She could feel him taking in what she was doing, the systematic nature of it, the fact that she'd already started before anyone had told her to. "Storm's going to be worse than the last one," he said. "I know. I've got the perishables wrapped. The main risk is the canvas on the east side. The lashing is fraying. I reported it in Dodge City, but it didn't get repaired." He looked at the canvas, then back at her. "I'll send someone." "I can handle it myself if you give me another 20 feet of rope." A brief pause. "I'll send someone with the rope." He sent Cutter, which she suspected was intentional, giving the boy a job that would put him in motion before the storm rather than letting him sit and work himself up about it. Cutter arrived with the rope, and the two of them spent 45 minutes reinforcing the lashing in the strengthening wind, Cutter holding the canvas flat against the frame while she nodded, both of them not talking much because the wind made talking difficult and because there wasn't much to say. The task was clear, and they both understood it. When it was done, he looked at her knotwork with what she read as genuine assessment. "Where'd you learn to tie like that?" "My father needed fence lines maintained in all weather. You learn to tie things so they stay tied." She tested the last knot with both hands. "Hold." The storm arrived an hour later and lasted through the night. It was not the kind of storm that announced itself dramatically. No lightning, no theatrical rolling thunder. It was simply wind and water in sustained, relentless quantity. The kind of weather that doesn't peak and resolve, but just continues, grinding, hour after hour, so that by 2 in the morning, the question was no longer whether you could manage it, but whether you could maintain the kind of dull, stubborn endurance required to still be managing it at 4. Lenora sat in the supply wagon through most of it, keeping the flour dry by repositioning the coverings as the wind found new angles, occasionally climbing out to check the lashing when she heard something shift that she didn't like. She was soaked through within the first hour and stayed that way. At some point in the middle of the night, she ate a cold biscuit from the morning's batch because she had forgotten to eat actual dinner in the preparation, which she was doing more frequently than she should have been, and which she filed away as something to correct. At roughly 3 in the morning, she heard something outside the wagon that wasn't wind. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, and then Gideon's voice through the canvas. "You still in there?" "Yes." A pause, as though he was deciding something. "Move over." She moved, and he climbed in out of the storm, bringing a significant amount of weather with him. He was soaked the same as she was, his hat bent down on one side from the wind. He settled on the opposite side of the wagon from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, just listening to the storm doing what it was doing outside. "Lashings held," he said eventually. "I know. I checked it at midnight. I checked it at 1. Another pause. "You did good work." She accepted this the way she'd learned to accept his sparse acknowledgments, without deflecting it and without making more of it than it was. "Thank you. You weren't planning to sleep tonight?" "I was planning to sleep when the storm allowed it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How's the hand?" She looked down at the wrapped right hand, which had become such a fixture of her daily experience that she sometimes forgot it was visible. "Healing." "Let me see it." "It's fine, Mrs. Ashby." Not a command exactly, more the specific tone of someone who isn't going to argue about a thing, but isn't going to let it go either. She unwrapped the cloth. The burn was healing, but it was still raw at the center, and the night's work in wet conditions hadn't been kind to it. He looked at it for a moment without expression, then reached into his coat and produced a small tin that she hadn't expected. "Salve," he said. He stopped, started again. "Someone sent it with me. My daughter packed the kit." She took the tin. "How old is your daughter?" "A beat." 7. Her name is Clara." He paused again, as though the name cost him something to say in this context, out here in the rain. "My son's 9. Daniel." She applied the salve carefully. It helped immediately. She could feel the difference. And she worked it in slowly while the storm beat against the canvas. "They're in Montana?" "With my sister's family. Have been since—" He didn't finish the sentence, and she didn't ask him to. She understood the shape of the sentence well enough. Since she died. The specific "since" that meant a person. "My wife," he said, because apparently he wanted to say it plainly. "Margaret, 14 months ago." "I'm sorry." She was... He stopped again, and this time it was different. Not painful exactly, but careful. "She was good with them. Better than I've been at knowing what they need." A pause. "I don't know what they need, especially Clara. She doesn't talk to me about anything that matters, and I can't tell if that's grief or just... if she's just like that now." Lenora thought about that, about a 7-year-old girl who had lost her mother and now had a father who was gone for months at a time managing cattle, and who had come back to a silent house with no idea how to reach a child who had gone somewhere he couldn't follow. "She needs time," Lenora said finally, "and she needs you to not stop trying even when it doesn't seem to be working. Kids that age aren't equipped to come to you. You have to keep going to them." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond. Then, "Is that what your father did?" She considered it. Eventually, he wasn't naturally good at it either. He just kept showing up. Outside, the storm shifted, found a new angle, threw a hard gust against the wagon side. The canvas held. Lenora rewrapped her hand with fresh cloth, and the salve did its quiet work, and they sat on opposite sides of a supply wagon in the middle of a Montana-bound cattle drive in the middle of the night, while the weather tried its best to make everything difficult, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. She would think about that later, about how that was the moment, not any of the ones that came after, that actually changed something, not a dramatic moment, not anything anyone would have seen if they'd been watching. Just 2 people in a dark wagon in the rain, talking about things that mattered. He left when the worst of the storm broke, just before dawn. She slept for 2 hours on the wagon floor with her head on a flour sack, and woke up to the sound of the camp beginning to move and got up and started the fire. She was sore in several places and her hand had stiffened overnight, and the 2 hours of sleep were not sufficient by any reasonable measure. She started the fire anyway. What happened in the following 2 weeks was less like a turning point and more like a slow accumulation, the way water carves stone, not in one event but in continuous contact over time. The crew was changing toward her, not dramatically, not with any announcements, but in the small, observable ways that mattered. Men who had been leaving their tins wherever they finished with them started bringing them back closer to the wash water. The complaining about food, which had been constant in the first 2 weeks, dropped off considerably, partly because her cooking had actually improved as she figured out the specific constraints of this trail and this equipment, and partly because complaining about someone's cooking when that someone had been visibly working through a burned hand for 2.5 weeks felt, even to men who weren't given to excessive sensitivity, like a particular kind of poor form. Walt had started talking to her properly. This happened gradually and without fanfare. He began by standing near the fire in the mornings while she was cooking, which she initially read as simple proximity, old body in need of warmth, but which she came to understand was intentional. He would stand there and occasionally offer observations about the trail ahead, about the terrain and what to expect and what he'd seen on previous drives, and she would listen and ask questions when she had them, and over the course of several mornings this became something that resembled actual conversation. Storm washed out the creek crossing at mile marker 42, he told her one morning, about 3 weeks out from the last supply stop. Did it in 71 and again in 79. Mercer knows, but it means we'll be moving the herd a mile south to find a shallower point, adds half a day. What does that do to the food supply? He looked at her. That's the first question anybody's asked me about that. Well, she adjusted the pot. It matters. Yeah, he said, and there was something in his voice that she couldn't quite name. It does. She ran the numbers that evening and presented them to Gideon without ceremony. Here is where we are. Here is what adding half a day does to the timeline. Here is what I need to compensate for it. And he listened and then said he'd see what could be sourced at the next stop and how much ahead of schedule they could push to recover the time. She appreciated that he treated it as a logistics problem to be solved rather than a complaint to be managed. That distinction mattered to her more than she would have been able to fully explain. Cole Briggs was watching all of this. She knew it. She could feel his attention the way you feel something that's pointed at you even when you can't see it directly. He hadn't done anything since the night Gideon intervened. Nothing direct, nothing that could be addressed plainly. But his attention had a quality to it that she recognized from certain men she'd encountered over the course of her life, men who cataloged grievances with patience and waited for the right conditions. And she was careful around him in the way you're careful around something that hasn't moved yet, but that you know is capable of moving suddenly. He found his opening on a Sunday. It was the kind of Sunday that happened on cattle drives, which meant it was identical to every other day except the men seemed to carry a vague consciousness of the day's designation and were consequently slightly more irritable about the fact that nothing about their circumstances reflected it. The herd had been difficult in the morning, 2 steers breaking from the group and requiring considerable effort to recover. And by midday the mood across the crew was poor. Lenora had spent the morning dealing with a problem of her own. The cast iron pot she used for the main meals had developed a crack, visible now as a dark line running a third of the way up the side. It wasn't all the way through yet, but it would be, and a pot that failed mid-cook on a trail was a different kind of crisis than a pot that failed in a kitchen where you could simply get another one. She had done what she could, packed the crack with a mixture of salt and fat that she'd learned from watching her grandmother maintain old equipment. And it was holding for now, but it wasn't a permanent fix. She was explaining this situation to Gideon during the midday stop when Cole appeared. He didn't interrupt directly. He positioned himself within the conversation's radius and waited, which was its own kind of intrusion. Gideon acknowledged him with a glance. "Something you need, Briggs?" "Heard there's a problem with the pot." Cole's voice was neutral, reasonable. "Just wanted to say this kind of thing is why some folks had concerns at the start. Equipment fails, no backup plan." "I have a backup plan," Lenora said. Cole looked at her as if he was surprised she'd spoken, which she knew was performance. "Ma'am, with respect, a salt pack isn't a plan. That pot cracks through on us 2 weeks out from Billings, and we've got 17 men and nothing to cook in. The salt pack will hold to the next supply point. I've already identified a secondary pot from the equipment list that can handle the main meals if needed. It's smaller, which means I'll cook in batches, which means meals will take longer, which I've already accounted for in the schedule. She paused. Is there something in that plan that concerns you specifically? A beat. She watched him recalibrate. You're awfully confident for someone who's been cooking on a trail for the first time, he said. The neutral tone was still there, but there was something underneath it now. I'm confident because I've been paying attention, she said, which I would suggest is all any of us can do. Gideon said, Briggs, I've got the pot situation handled. Anything else? Cole held her gaze for a moment before shifting to Gideon. Just looking out for the crew, he said, and walked away. She watched him go. Then she went back to what she'd been doing. That evening, Cutter appeared at the wagon while she was doing the post-dinner work. He stood for a while in his usual way before saying, Briggs has been talking to some of the men. She kept working. About what? You? A pause. About how the trail boss spending time around the supply wagon isn't... He stopped, clearly uncomfortable with the actual words. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. He was 16 or 17, and his face was doing the thing young faces do when they're trying to navigate a social complexity that they don't have quite enough experience to fully map. She felt a quick protective irritation on his behalf, that he'd been put in the position of carrying this to her. I appreciate you telling me, she said. Don't repeat it to anyone else, and don't let Briggs use you to carry his messages again. Cutter's jaw tightened. I wasn't carrying his message, I just thought you should know. I know the difference, she said more gently. That's why I said I appreciate it. He nodded, still uncomfortable, and left. She thought about it later, alone, with the camp quiet around her. Cole wasn't stupid. He'd shifted his approach from direct harassment to something more insidious. The suggestion, planted carefully in the minds of the crew, that whatever regard the trail boss showed for the cook was not professional in nature. It was the kind of thing that was very difficult to address directly because it lived in implication, and addressing the implication out loud gave it a weight and a reality it wouldn't otherwise have. The best response was to give it no fuel. Be consistent. Do the work. Don't give anyone anything to point to. She knew this. It was exhausting to know it, but she knew it. What she hadn't accounted for was Gideon. It was 4 days later when he found her early in the morning, before the camp was properly awake. She was starting the fire, in the particular gray quiet of that hour that she had come to think of as her time. The one part of the day that belonged entirely to her, before the noise and the demands and the continuous navigation of being the only woman among 17 men. He appeared at the edge of the firelight and crouched down across the fire from her without announcement, which was his way. I've heard what Briggs has been saying, he said. She kept her eyes on the fire. I assumed you would eventually. I should have addressed it sooner. You can't police what men say when you're not listening. I can make clear what I expect. He paused. I'm going to speak to him today. She looked up then. What will you say? That his commentary about my conduct is not his business, and that if he has a problem with how this drive is being run, he can take it up with me directly and formally, and I'll discharge him before sundown. A pause. And that he will address you with the same respect he would address any member of this crew, or there will be consequences that are specific and immediate. She looked at him across the fire. There was no particular expression on his face. This was just a statement of what was going to happen, the way he stated most things. But she could hear beneath it the thing that wasn't being said, which was that this was costing him something, that addressing Cole Briggs directly and publicly was a move with weight on a trail where authority was maintained through the careful management of exactly these kinds of confrontations, and that he was making it anyway. You don't have to do that on my account, she said. I'm doing it on account of this drive, he said, which cannot function when a member of this crew is working to undermine it. She accepted that framing. She understood why he offered it that way. All right. He looked at her for a moment. You've been managing it on your own. I'm used to managing things on my own. I know, he said, and something in the way he said it made it clear that this was not a compliment to her self-sufficiency, but an observation about a pattern that he had found, in some way she couldn't fully read yet, to be both admirable and quietly painful to witness. He stood up and walked back toward the horses. She watched the fire and thought about that, about being seen, about the particular weight of being seen accurately by someone you respected, which was different from almost every other kind of being seen. The conversation with Cole Briggs happened mid-morning, out near the flank of the herd where Cole was working. She wasn't there for it and didn't try to be. She learned about it the way you learn most things on a trail, through the quality of silence that followed it, through what people didn't say and how they held themselves in the hours after. Cole came back to camp for the midday meal and served himself without comment and sat apart from the main group and ate. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. The meal proceeded. Something had been settled. She didn't know what Cole would do with it. He wasn't the kind of man who simply absorbed a confrontation and recalibrated and moved on. She was certain of that. But for now, in this specific afternoon, the thing that had been pressing on the camp's atmosphere had been addressed, and the pressure had shifted. Walt, eating his midday portion nearby, said nothing. But when he finished, he looked over at her briefly and gave a short nod. A single, economical gesture that meant something in his vocabulary, she'd learned, even if it would have meant nothing to someone who hadn't been paying attention. She nodded back. That evening, for the first time since the drive began, she sat by the main fire after the cleaning was done, rather than retreating immediately to the supply wagon. She brought her mending with her. There was always mending, her own and small repairs on the wagon canvas. And she sat at the edge of the group and worked, and the men around the fire continued talking the way they'd been talking, and nobody made it remarkable. Gideon was not at the fire. He was doing his night rounds, which he did personally every evening. The perimeter of the herd, the positions of the night riders, the state of the camp before he allowed himself to rest. She knew his habits by now, the way you know the habits of someone you've been living near for over a month. But when he came back, he took a position at the fire, and she was still there. And he looked at her once, just once, brief and unremarked, and looked away at the fire, and that was all. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. She finished her mending some time after the fire had burned low and most of the men had gone to their bedrolls. The night was cold and clear and very quiet in the way that open country gets quiet, which is a different kind of quiet from anywhere else. Fuller, somehow, as though the quiet itself has weight. She gathered her things and went back to the wagon. She was tired in the bone-deep way she'd been tired for 5 weeks, and she would be up again in 4 hours, and there was a day coming that would be like every other day in its demands and its difficulty and the 1,000 small adjustments required to meet it. But something was different, and she knew it, and she wasn't sure what to call it, and so she didn't try to name it. She just filed it alongside the other things she kept in her internal ledger, the ones that meant something even when they weren't said out loud, and closed her eyes and slept. She had stopped counting the days somewhere around week 6, not because she'd lost track. She kept meticulous inventory of dates the same way she kept inventory of flour sacks and dried beans, because on a trail the calendar was a practical instrument rather than an emotional one. She stopped counting because the drive had become its own kind of time, separate from the calendar she'd lived by before, and measuring it in days felt like the wrong unit. You measured it in crossings and storms and miles of ground covered and problems solved and problems that couldn't be solved and were simply endured. They were 7 weeks out of Wichita when the grass changed. Walt noticed it first, which was how it usually went with Walt. He noticed things before other people did and said them quietly, without drama, as statements of fact rather than warnings. He told her one morning while she was cooking that the grazing was thinning ahead and that this stretch of the drive was historically the hardest on the herd, that the cattle would lose condition over the next 2 weeks and the men would feel it in the animals' tempers. Hungry cattle are stupid cattle, he said. They spook at things that wouldn't normally register. Wind direction changes, a rabbit coming out of the grass wrong. You want to be aware of that around the wagon. She appreciated the warning and said so, and he nodded and walked away, and she added it to her inventory of things to be aware of, the constantly expanding list of this place and what it required of the people trying to cross it. The herd's deteriorating mood became apparent within 4 days. Animals that had been manageable, that the experienced hands could read and predict, began showing the particular restlessness that comes from insufficient food. They moved differently, tighter together in some moments, and then suddenly prone to spreading wide without obvious trigger. The night riders doubled their circuits without being asked, and came in for breakfast with the hollow-eyed look of men who had been watching darkness and waiting for something to go wrong for 8 hours. Gideon was everywhere during this stretch. She'd think she knew where he was, and then find him somewhere else entirely. At the front of the herd, at the back, riding the flanks, talking to the night riders before they went out, talking to the day riders when they came in. He was managing something complex and doing it without appearing to rush, and the crew responded to that in the way crews respond to a leader who stays level when conditions don't. They stayed level themselves, or near enough. She did her part by making sure the food was right. This was harder now than it had been, because the supply situation had tightened over the past 2 weeks. The pacing math had compressed slightly after the creek crossing detour, and she was working with less than she'd have preferred while producing the same volume for 17 men who were working harder than ever and needed the calories. She'd gotten creative in ways she hadn't anticipated, using rendered fat to stretch the beans, adding more dried herbs to compensate for the reduced meat portions, calculating the biscuit batches to a degree of precision that would have seemed excessive to someone who hadn't been trying to feed a working crew on a thinning budget for 7 weeks. Nobody complained. She noticed this specifically because the complaining had been so constant in the early weeks, and now there was almost none of it, and she understood the difference. It wasn't that the food had become dramatically better, though it had improved. It was that the men had seen enough by now to understand what she was doing with what she had, and there was a specific kind of respect that develops in hard conditions between people who can see each other's competence clearly. Even among the men who still kept their distance from her personally, there was this. Cole Briggs ate her food every day without comment. Since Gideon's direct conversation with him, Cole had shifted into a different mode. Not reformed, not apologetic, nothing as clean or satisfying as either of those things, just contained. He did his work, which he did well, and he interacted with her as minimally as possible, and the energy between them had the quality of something that has been pressed down rather than resolved. She was not under any illusion that it had gone away. She was simply grateful that it had gone underground, at least for now, because she had enough to manage without it. The morning the smoke appeared on the horizon, she was 3 hours into the day's work. She saw it while she was loading the wagon after breakfast. A different quality to the southern sky. Not quite cloud, not quite weather. The particular yellow-gray color that she hadn't seen before, but that she recognized the way you recognize something from a description rather than from experience. She had been told about prairie fires. Walt had mentioned them in passing 2 weeks ago. The same casual, informational way he mentioned everything, and she had filed the information and hadn't thought about it since because the conditions hadn't warranted it. The conditions now warranted it. She climbed onto the wagon board for a better view and stood there with one hand on the frame, and what she saw on the southern horizon made her stomach drop in a clean, cold way. It wasn't close yet, but it was big, and it was moving, and the wind was doing something it hadn't been doing 20 minutes ago when she'd checked it. It was shifting, turning from its consistent northwesterly direction towards something more directly northern, and if it continued doing that, the fire would stop traveling parallel to their route and begin traveling toward it. She climbed down and walked quickly to where Gideon was talking to 2 of the hands near the front of the herd. She didn't run because running would tell the crew something was wrong before she'd had a chance to tell the trail boss, and the order of information mattered here. "Fire," she said when she was close enough. "Southern horizon. Wind is shifting north." Gideon turned to look before she'd finished the sentence. He stood very still for exactly 3 seconds. She counted, because she noticed it, the quality of his stillness in that moment. And then he was moving. What followed was a kind of controlled chaos that she had not previously witnessed and hoped never to witness again, though she would witness it again before the day was over in forms considerably worse than this initial hour. Gideon moved through the camp giving orders in a rapid, precise sequence. No wasted words, no repeated instructions. Each man assigned a specific function and expected to execute it without further direction. The night riders who had just come in from their circuits were turned around and sent back out to begin pushing the herd north. The day riders fanned out to the flanks. Cutter was sent to the supply wagon. "Stay with her," Gideon told him, which she registered as 2 things simultaneously. a practical assignment and a protective one, both of which she accepted without objection because this was not the moment for objecting. The next 2 hours were unlike anything she had experienced. The fire moved faster than she would have believed possible. She understood in an intellectual way that fires on dry grassland could travel quickly, had heard this stated as fact, but the reality of watching the smoke column grow from a distant discoloration to a presence that filled a third of the southern sky, that happened at a pace that made her throat tight in a physical way, a reflexive biological response to something that was categorically dangerous and getting categorically more dangerous at a rate she could measure with her eyes. The herd knew. The cattle knew before most of the men did, or at least they reacted to the knowledge faster. A low rolling disturbance moved through the herd that she could see from the wagon board, a collective shift in weight and direction that wasn't quite movement yet, but was the gathering precondition of it. She drove the supply wagon hard to keep pace with the herd's accelerating movement north. The cracked pot bounced in its lashing, and she heard it hit the wagon side and said something sharp under her breath and kept driving. Cutter rode alongside, his young face pale and very focused in a way that she'd come to associate with him at his best. When things were bad, he tended to distill down to pure function, which she respected. "How far does it have to get before it doesn't matter, B'cha?" he called over. "I don't know this country well enough to say." She watched the smoke. Walt would know. Walt's with the right flank. She kept driving. The wind made its full shift at around noon. She felt it change direction against her face, a hot, wrong-tasting air suddenly coming from the south rather than the northwest. And she knew what it meant even before she saw the effect on the smoke column, which stopped traveling sideways and began traveling toward her. The herd broke. Not all at once, and not cleanly. It was a section of the right flank that went first, 40 or 50 animals at the outside edge, who had been in contact with the hot air and the smell of smoke longer than the others. And they didn't go in one organized direction. They went in the way panicked animals go, which is to say, in every direction that wasn't toward the thing that frightened them. The problem was that this was contagious in the specific way that panic is contagious among animals. And within 4 minutes, what had been a right flank break had become a general condition that the riders were fighting on every side. She watched Gideon from a distance during this. She could identify him by the particular way he rode, the economy of it, the way he and his horse moved as though they'd been solving problems together for a long time, which they had. He was at the center of the worst of it, pushing animals back toward the group, reading where the next break was going to come from before it came from there, and positioning himself to address it. It was impressive in the specific way competence under extreme pressure is impressive. Not theatrical, just absolutely sufficient to the moment. Then his horse went down. She saw it happen. The horse didn't fall. It shied hard to the right on something, maybe a hole, maybe a stone, the kind of thing that happens in broken country at high speed. And Gideon went over its neck and hit the ground in front of the reforming herd. She didn't think. This was the honest truth of it that she would have difficulty explaining later. There was no deliberation, no moment of weighing options. There was what she saw and there was what she did, and between those two things there was nothing at all. She set the brake on the wagon, stood up on the board, and looked at where Gideon had gone down. He was not moving. The herd was moving. The gap between those two facts was approximately 40 yards in closing. The supply wagon carried a bullwhip. It was a standard piece of trail equipment used for managing cattle and not for anything else, and she had known it was there since her first inventory in Wichita. She had never used one. She had, twice, watched the experienced hands demonstrate the technique to Cutter, and she had watched with the focused attention she brought to everything she observed on this trail. Understanding as she watched that competence with a bullwhip came from years of practice, and that she had neither years nor practice, and that knowing how something was supposed to work was not the same as being able to make it work. She reached back and took the bullwhip from its bracket. "Mrs. Ashby!" Cutter's voice high and cracked with alarm. She had already climbed down from the wagon. She was already walking toward Gideon, toward the herd, with the bullwhip in her right hand. The burned hand, the hand that had been healing for 7 weeks, that still gave her pain on cold mornings and in wet conditions. She felt the handle in her grip and the weight of the lash trailing on the ground behind her, and she kept walking. She was aware of several things simultaneously in the way that extreme moments sometimes produce a strange clarity rather than the confusion you'd expect. She was aware that the wind smelled of smoke and dry grass, She was aware that her heart was going very fast. She was aware that Gideon was down and not moving, and that the fastest moving section of the herd was perhaps 30 yards from him now, and that the riders on the flanks were occupied with keeping the worst of the animals away from the wagon and from the section of broken country to the west, and could not get to him in time. She was aware also that she was terrified. This didn't stop her. She had been afraid before, the kind of afraid that lives in the body rather than the mind. And she had learned that fear and movement were not mutually exclusive, that you could be genuinely, viscerally frightened and still put one foot in front of the other, and that sometimes this was all survival required. She planted herself between the charging herd and the fallen trail boss. She cracked the whip. The first attempt was poor. The lash went wide and the snap was weak, the product of inexperience and a hand that was not fully recovered, but it was loud enough. The lead animals of the approaching group checked, but didn't stop. She cracked it again. Better this time. She put her shoulder into it the way she'd watched the hands do, the motion coming from the back and through the arm rather than from the wrist, and the report was sharper, and the two lead animals split, going wide on either side of the position she was holding. But there were more behind them. This was the moment she understood, in a bone-deep way that no amount of prior information could have fully communicated, what a stampede actually was. Not a group of animals making a collective decision, but a mass of individual panicked creatures, each reacting to the ones immediately around them. And stopping a stampede was not like stopping one animal, but like trying to redirect a river with your hands. The animals that split to her left and right created new pressure behind them as others followed their paths, and the ones in the center kept coming. She cracked the whip a third time, left side. A fourth time, right. Her arm was burning. The shoulder, the whole right side, and her hand was sending pain signals up her arm with increasing urgency, and she ignored them. She was screaming. She didn't know when she'd started, but she could hear herself. Not words, just sound. The kind of sound that comes out of a person when they're trying to be larger than they are, louder, more present, more real to the animals that needed to believe she was something worth going around. She was 20 yards from Gideon now. She'd been walking backward, making herself bigger, keeping the whip moving, keeping herself between him and the herd, buying feet instead of yards. The cattle were going around her. Not cleanly, not without contact. The edge of the left flank was close enough that she felt the displaced air from the bodies moving past. And she held her ground and kept the whip active and screaming, and they went around. Not all of them, and not easily, and she took a glancing hit to her left shoulder from an animal that passed within a foot of her, and it spun her half around, and she caught her footing and turned back and kept going. Behind her, Gideon groaned. She heard it under everything else, the thunder of hooves, the noise she was making, the general chaos of the world in that moment. And she heard it because she had been listening for it, had been tracking it the way you track a specific thread in a piece of fabric when you're trying to find where it begins. "Mercer," she said, loud and close. Another groan, then, "Down. I know you're down. I need you to get up." "Horse. The horse is fine. Get up." She didn't know if the horse was fine. She hadn't looked. But she needed him moving, and she needed him moving now because the main body of the herd had altered its course enough that they were going to be in a different kind of danger in approximately 2 minutes. The fire was closer, the wind was still wrong, and the position they were in was going to become untenable. She heard him behind her. The sounds of someone getting to his feet when getting to their feet was difficult. A sharp exhale that meant pain. She didn't turn around. She kept the whip moving, kept her position, until she felt his hand on her shoulder. "I've got it," he said, his voice rough and not entirely steady. She handed him the whip without discussion. He took it, and she stepped to the side, and for the first time since she'd climbed down from the wagon, she let herself look at him. His face was gray-white under the trail tan, and there was blood at his hairline from the fall, and he was holding his left side in a way that suggested something there was damaged, though he was standing, and he was present, and his eyes were clear. "Ribs," he said, reading her look. "How many?" "1. Maybe 2. I've had it before." He cracked the whip, and his face tightened with the motion, but his arm didn't falter. "Can you drive?" "Yes." "Get to the wagon. Drive north, hard as it'll go. I'll be right behind you." She ran. Cutter had not left. She'd half expected him to have moved the wagon back to safety. It would have been the sensible thing, and she wouldn't have blamed him. but he was where she'd left him, white-faced and holding position, and when she pulled herself up onto the board, he said, "I wasn't going to leave without you." "I know," she said, though she hadn't known. She released the brake and got the horses moving, and she didn't look back. They drove north for 20 minutes with the fire closing the distance behind them. She could feel the heat against her back by the end. Not imagined heat, actual heat, the kind that tells you how close something is without requiring you to look. The horses were frightened, and she used every piece of knowledge she had about frightened horses to keep them moving in the right direction rather than in the direction that fear was telling them to go, which was any direction that wasn't forward. The fire line shifted west before it reached them. She didn't understand fully why until Walt explained it later. A break in the fuel, a dry creek bed running east to west that had nothing to burn, and the fire had followed the grass rather than jumping the gap. It moved west and south along that line instead of continuing north, and within another half hour it had dropped behind the horizon of smoke that had been following them, and the air began to taste less of burning. She stopped the wagon. She sat there for a long moment without moving. Her right arm was trembling, had been trembling since she'd stopped cracking the whip and hadn't stopped, and her left shoulder where the animal had caught her was going to be a serious bruise by morning. She could already feel it hardening under the skin. Her hand was bleeding. She hadn't known that, and she looked at it now. The burn scar had reopened along the older edge. Not badly, but enough. And she wrapped it in the hem of her shirt and looked out at the landscape, which had settled into the particular quietness that follows extreme things. Gideon rode up alongside the wagon. He was on a different horse. Cutter must have gotten it for him. And he was sitting carefully, with the stiffness of a man managing pain. He has decided not to talk about more than is strictly necessary. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked at him. "Your hand," he said. "I know. That was—" He stopped, started again. "You didn't have to do that. You were going to be trampled. I know what I was going to be." His voice was quiet in a way she hadn't heard before. Not soft. Gideon Mercer didn't go soft, but something that had more weight to it than his normal register. "I know what you did." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The crew came back together over the following hour. Riders coming in from the positions they'd held during the worst of it, accounting for themselves and each other, checking the herd. Remarkably, catastrophically, they had lost 11 animals. In the context of the full herd, this was a loss, but not a devastating one. 2 horses were lamed. No men were badly hurt, which was something close to a miracle given what the past 3 hours had contained. And she was careful not to use that word even internally, because it put a ceiling on what human effort and competence had actually achieved. When the crew assembled at the wagon for water and food, they were quiet in the way men are quiet after something that has genuinely frightened them. And she noticed, standing at the wagon, distributing what she had, that something had changed in the way they looked at her. Not at her face, at her directly, deliberately, in the way people look at someone they've reconsidered. Walt looked at her and gave a short nod, the one that meant something in his economy, and this time it was different from the previous times. Fuller, somehow. Like the thing being acknowledged was larger. Cutter was hovering near her, which she now recognized as his way of expressing things he couldn't yet put into words. She let him hover. Cole Briggs was the last to come for water. He came to the wagon and held out his tin, and she filled it, and he stood there for a moment not moving, his tin full, and she waited to see what he was going to do. He looked at her. Something in his face was different, not warmth, not apology, nothing that comfortable, but a kind of adjustment. The specific look of a man who has had a private estimation revised against his will and is still in the process of deciding what to do with the revision. He walked away without saying anything. She watched him go. She thought about the fact that he'd come to her wagon, which he hadn't had to do. There were other water sources available. And about what that silence meant in the specific language this group of men had been communicating in for 7 weeks, which was a language mostly made of what people did rather than what they said. She filed it, added it to the ledger. That night the camp was different. It was quieter than usual, but not the uncomfortable quiet of the early weeks. The quiet of people who have shared something and don't need to name it. Men who would not normally have acknowledged her presence said small things as they came and went from the fire. Not dramatic things, just small acknowledgments. A thank you for the food, a comment about tomorrow's weather. The ordinary currency of people who have decided someone exists in their space. She sat by the fire again after the cleaning was done, the same as she'd started doing in the last 2 weeks. She had her mending with her, the same as usual. Her arm still trembled if she held it at a certain angle, and her shoulder was stiffening badly, and she was tired in a way that felt like it went deeper than the day's events, more like something accumulated over weeks, finally sitting down all at once. Gideon sat near her, not beside her, not so close that it would register as anything, but near. He was moving carefully, with the measured economy of someone managing broken ribs, and she could see that even that economy cost him, that each breath was a small negotiation. "You should let someone wrap those ribs tonight," she said, quietly enough that it was just between them. "Probably," he agreed, which was more capitulation than she expected. "I have cloth, and I know how." A pause. "All right," he said. She wrapped his ribs after the fire died down, with most of the men asleep, working by the remaining light and by feel, her hands careful around the damage. He made no sound. She worked in silence, and he sat still and let her. And when she was done and had tied off the wrapping, she sat back and they stayed in the quiet for a moment, close enough for the conversation to be real. "2," she said. "Maybe 3. You need to stop moving like they aren't there." "I know." "I mean it. If you ride the way you rode today tomorrow, you'll make them worse." "I understand what you're saying." "Do you plan to do anything about it?" The briefest thing that was almost a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I'll do what the drive requires." She shook her head. "That's what I thought." She gathered the remaining cloth and stood. He looked up at her from where he was sitting, and there was something in his face that she had been seeing incrementally for weeks now, something she hadn't let herself name because naming things changed them, and she hadn't been ready for that yet. She wasn't entirely sure she was ready now. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and walked back to the wagon. Behind her, the fire had burned all the way down to coals, just a dim orange glow in the dark, and somewhere out in the blackness, the herd made its quiet, steady sounds. She lay down on the wagon floor. Her shoulder throbbed. Her hand ached. She was tired enough that sleep should have come immediately, but it didn't, because her mind was still running, cataloging the day, adjusting calculations, the way her mind always ran at the end of difficult things, sorting and filing and preparing for what came next. She thought about Gideon's face when he'd looked up at her. Then she made herself stop thinking about it, the same way she'd made herself stop thinking about Thomas on the first nights of the drive, the same practical self-management she'd been applying to things that were large and complicated and couldn't be resolved tonight. Not tonight. Tonight was for sleep. She closed her eyes and eventually she slept. She woke up the next morning and the shoulder was worse than she'd expected. She had known it would stiffen overnight. That was the nature of that kind of bruising, the way impact damage always announced itself more fully in the hours after, once the body had stopped running on the particular chemistry of crisis and settled back into its ordinary accounting. But the degree of it surprised her. She could raise her left arm to about shoulder height before the pain made further movement inadvisable. And she stood for a moment in the gray pre-dawn beside the supply wagon, doing a quiet inventory of what that meant for the day's work and how she was going to manage around it. She managed around it the way she managed around everything. Adjusted her technique, used the right arm more heavily where she could afford to, used the left where she couldn't afford not to, and didn't mention it to anyone. The camp that morning had a quality she hadn't felt before. Kind of collective exhale. The particular atmosphere of people who have survived something together and are still in the process of registering that they survived it. Men spoke to each other differently, not dramatically, but with the slight additional weight that comes after fear has passed. And what's left is the recognition that you're all still here. Walt brought his tin to the wash water without being anywhere near the fire yet, when she noticed something in his movement. The knees were worse than usual, the stiffness visible in how he managed the 3 steps down from the wagon he'd been sitting on. She filled his tin without comment and handed it back, and he took it and then stood there a moment in his way. "You know what you did yesterday?" he said. "I know what I did." I want to make sure you know what it looked like from where the rest of us were." She looked at him. He was not a man who offered many words, and when he used them, she had learned to listen carefully to the specific ones he chose. "We could see it," he said. "All of us who weren't directly in the thick of it. We could see you standing there, with the whip." A pause. There's not a man on this crew who would say different about what that was. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she said, "Thank you, Walt." And he nodded and walked away, and she went back to work. Gideon was on horseback by the time the camp was moving, which did not surprise her, and which she had already decided she wasn't going to fight him on. She had said what she had to say about the ribs the night before. He was a grown man making an informed choice, and arguing with him about it publicly would help neither of them. She watched him from the corner of her eye during the morning and could see the cost of each movement in the careful way he held himself, the slightly shallower breaths, the way he distributed his weight on the horse with more deliberation than usual. He was managing. He would continue to manage. That was who he was. The terrain had changed again in the past 2 days. They were into a stretch that felt older somehow, the land more folded and various than the flat grassland they'd spent weeks crossing, with low hills and draws that broke the sight lines and made the work of keeping the herd together more complex. Gideon had told her 3 days ago that they were 10 days from the Montana border, which had seemed almost theoretical at the time, and now felt real and proximate in a way that changed something in the atmosphere of the drive. 10 days. After 10 weeks, 10 days felt like almost nothing, and also like an enormous amount of territory between them and the end. The proposal, if it could be called that, though it was the word that would attach itself to the memory later, didn't happen the way she would have expected anything like it to happen. Not that she had been expecting it. She genuinely hadn't been, which was something she would examine later and conclude was probably for the best, because if she'd been anticipating it, she would have spent time constructing a response, and whatever response she'd constructed would have been wrong in some way. It happened on the 9th night before the border. She had been awake later than usual because the cracked pot, the salt pack holding admirably for 7 weeks, had finally given way. Not catastrophically, not all at once. Just a split along the existing line that had widened enough in the heat of the fire to make the pot unusable for anything pressurized. She'd caught it before it became a disaster, transferred the contents to the secondary pot she'd identified weeks ago, and spent an extra hour reconfiguring the cooking setup for the smaller vessel. By the time she'd finished and cleaned the equipment, the camp was quiet and the fire was low, and she was tired in the specific way that came after unexpected problems absorbed on top of an already full day. She was sitting at the edge of the fire, not mending tonight, just sitting, something she rarely allowed herself, when she heard Gideon's footsteps and felt him settle onto the ground a few feet to her left. He'd been doing his rounds. She'd heard him leave and return the way she heard most things in this camp by now, through a kind of ambient awareness that had developed over 10 weeks of living in close proximity to the same group of people. They sat in silence for a while. This was comfortable between them now. The silence had changed in quality over the weeks, from the neutral silence of two people who didn't know each other to something with more content in it. "Pot's done," she said eventually. "I know, Walt told me. The secondary setup will work. It'll add time to the morning meal, maybe 20 minutes, but I'll adjust when I start." He didn't respond to that right away. She looked at the fire. "I've been thinking," he said. "About the supply situation?" "No." A pause. Long enough that she looked over at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and there was something in the set of his jaw that she recognized as the expression he wore when he was deciding to say a thing he'd been holding for a while. "About what happens when we reach Billings." She waited. "I have a ranch," he said. "You know that. 40 miles northeast of Billings, up toward the Yellowstone. My sister's family has been running it since Margaret died, doing their best, which is, they have their own place to manage. They can't do it indefinitely. I understand that. Clara and Daniel are there." He picked up a small piece of wood and turned it in his hands. "I've been trying to figure out for 14 months what the right arrangement is. For them. For the ranch. A housekeeper maybe, or... But the children aren't a job. They're not a problem you solve by hiring someone." He stopped. "Put the wood down. I've been watching you for 10 weeks. She felt something shift, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a quiet rearrangement of the air. "I know what kind of person you are," he said. "I know how you think and how you work and how you handle things when they go wrong and how you treat people who can't do anything for you. I know you're not perfect, and I'm not suggesting you are, and I'm not either. And the ranch is hard work, and Montana winters they're serious." He finally looked at her. "I'd like you to consider marrying me." She looked back at him. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did when something cost him, very still, very composed, the emotion not absent but held in, contained by a deliberate act of will. She understood this quality in him because she recognized it from the inside, from her own version of the same management strategy. "That's not an impulsive question," she said. "No." "You've been thinking about this for some time." "Yes." She looked at the fire again. Thomas had proposed to her in her father's parlor with a bunch of wildflowers he'd picked that morning, and a speech he'd clearly prepared and slightly garbled in his nervousness, and she had found it both touching and faintly exhausting and had said yes because she'd meant it. Gideon Mercer was sitting on the ground beside a dying campfire 10 days from the Montana border with broken ribs and wind-burned hands, and was asking in the same unadorned way he did everything, and she found it. She wasn't sure what she found it. She found it him. It was completely him, and she didn't know exactly what to do with the feeling that produced. "Your children don't know me," she said. "I know. That matters more than what I decide sitting here tonight. If Clara and Daniel, if they can't accept it, then there's no—" "I know that too." He paused. "I'm not asking you to commit to a final answer tonight. I'm asking you to consider it, to come to Montana with that consideration in mind rather than whatever else you were planning." She had not, she realized, made any concrete plan for what came after Billings. She had been focused for 10 weeks on the drive itself, on the daily management of her role and her circumstances, and the end of it had remained a theoretical point on a map rather than a place she'd built actual plans around. She had her wages coming. She had currently no fixed address and no particular direction. "I'll consider it," she said. He nodded, and that was the end of it for that night. He got up carefully, managing the ribs, and said goodnight and walked to his bedroll, and she stayed at the fire for another 20 minutes thinking about the specific nature of what he had asked, and what it would mean, and what the 1,000 practical complications of it were, and what, underneath all of that, she actually felt. She went to sleep without reaching a conclusion, which she recognized as the honest state of the situation and not a failure to decide. The next day arrived with the ordinary demands of the trail, and she met them. And Gideon was the trail boss, and she was the cook, and they were professional with each other in a way that had its own particular weight now, carrying as it did the knowledge of what had been said the night before. She noticed that he noticed her during the day, brief, functional glances that checked on what she was doing and whether she needed anything, which was the same as always, except that she was aware of them differently. Cole Briggs noticed the difference. She saw him noticing it. She had not forgotten Cole Briggs. She had filed him in the category of things that were temporarily contained rather than resolved, and she had kept a consistent peripheral awareness of him the way you keep peripheral awareness of anything that has proven itself capable of movement without warning. Since Gideon's direct confrontation with him weeks ago, Cole had been functioning, had been doing his work, had not said or done anything that could be addressed plainly. But there was something in the way he'd watched her since the fire, since her standing between the herd and Gideon, since the crew's response to it, that had the quality of something recalculating. He didn't wait long. 6 days from the border, at the midday meal, he set it in front of everyone. She had been distributing the food, and the crew was collecting their portions in the usual loose assembly around the wagon, and the mood was relatively settled. They were close enough to the end that even the most weathered hands had a slightly different quality to their energy, something that wasn't quite anticipation, but was adjacent to it. Cutter had been talking about what he was going to eat first in Billings, which had generated more discussion than might have been expected from a group of men who generally kept their feelings close. Cole took his plate and stood and said, without raising his voice, without making it dramatic, just saying it into the air the way you say something you've decided to say, "Must be nice to have the trail boss looking out for you. Makes the whole drive easier, I'd imagine." The camp went quiet. Not the gradual quiet of conversations winding down, The immediate, specific quiet of a group of people who have recognized that something has been put in the open that now requires a response. She kept her hands moving. She was filling the next tin, Walt's, and she finished filling it and handed it to him, and then she looked at Cole. "You're welcome to describe any part of this drive," she said, "that looked easy to you." A few of the men shifted. Cole tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was warming up. "Didn't say easy," he said. "Said easier. There's a difference. Trail Boss makes it clear you're under his protection. Men treat you accordingly. That's not the same thing as earning it." "Cole?" Gideon's voice came from somewhere to her left. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Cole. "I'm having a conversation," Cole said to Gideon, not dismissively, but he knew better than outright dismissal, but with the specific tone of a man who has decided he's going to say his piece and is willing to accept the consequences. "You're going to want to stop," Gideon said. "Is that right?" Cole looked at the men around him. Not dramatically, just a scan, the kind of look that's asking a question without asking it. "You all see this, don't you? You all see how this works?" "I've got nothing against Mrs. Ashby personally. I'm just making an observation that a lot of men on this crew—" "No." The word came from Walt. Everyone looked at Walt, including Cole, because Walt almost never inserted himself into anything that wasn't directly his business, and his saying a single word with that particular finality was its own kind of event. "No," Walt said again, quieter. "You don't speak for this crew, Briggs. Don't use us for what you're doing." Cole stared at him for a moment. Then he looked around the group, and what he found there, not hostility exactly, but the specific absence of the agreement he'd expected to find, the absence of the shared male resentment he'd been banking on, did something to his expression, a calculation being revised. Gideon stepped forward then, and she saw it and knew what he was going to do, and she put out a hand, not touching him, just near, just enough. "I want to say something," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him, briefly, just long enough to communicate that she meant it, and he stopped where he was. She turned to Cole. She thought about what she wanted to say, and then she said it plainly without preparation, the way you say things that are simply true. "You've been waiting for the right moment to say that since the first week," she said. "I know that. I've known it for a long time. And I think what you're actually saying is that you don't understand how a woman with nothing, no name, no land, no family connections, nothing to recommend her, ends up being treated as though she belongs here. And I understand why that doesn't make sense to you. Because in your experience, the way a person gets treated is a reflection of what they have, not who they are." She paused. Cole was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I didn't come on this drive with anything," she said. $4.32 in a bag. I burned my hand in the first week, and the pot cracked on me and the coffee ran out, and every time something went wrong, I had two choices. Find a way or don't. I found a way. Every time." She let that sit for a moment. "What Trail Boss Mercer has done is see that. That's all. And if you've been on this drive for 10 weeks and you haven't seen it yourself, then the problem isn't his judgment. It's your attention." The camp was completely silent. Cole held her gaze for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't name it precisely. Didn't try to. Then he looked down at his plate and said nothing and walked to the edge of the group and sat down and began to eat. She turned back to the wagon and continued serving. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she was aware of, and she was grateful that no one was looking at her hands. Gideon was standing nearby. When the camp resumed its normal volume, conversation returning gradually, the moment being absorbed and integrated, he stepped close enough to say quietly, "You didn't need me to step in." "No," she said. "But I knew you were going to. Is that why you stopped me?" She handed the next tin to its owner, Cutter, who was looking at her with an expression that mixed admiration and 17-year-old discomfort in roughly equal proportions. "I stopped you because it needed to come from me," she said, "not from you defending me. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said, "there is." The final days of the drive settled into a different rhythm. She had noticed this at the end of hard things before. The way the last stretch had its own particular quality, different from the middle, when you were too far in to go back and not far enough along to see the end. You were in the end now. You could feel it in the pace of things, the way conversations had shifted toward what came after, the way men who'd spent weeks barely speaking to each other suddenly wanted to tell stories, to account for what they'd been through, to put language around the experience before it became just another drive in a life full of drives. Walt told her about his wife one evening. He'd never mentioned her before and didn't make an occasion of it, just said, while standing near the fire, that his wife had been a practical woman who'd kept their house in order for 31 years, and that practical women were, in his observation, the most underrated kind of people in the world. He said this looking at the fire. Then he said goodnight and went to his bedroll. She thought about that for a long time afterward. Cutter asked her, 3 days from the border, what she was going to do when the drive ended. He asked it with the directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to worry about whether the question is appropriate, and she found she didn't mind. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said. "You could come back next year," he said, "if Mercer runs another drive." And then he turned bright red because he had clearly heard himself and recognized that this was not as casual a statement as he'd intended, and she chose to let him off the hook by not commenting on it directly. "I'll figure something out," she said. "I always do." He nodded seriously, as though this was useful information. "Yeah," he said, "I think you probably will." The night before they crossed into Montana, Gideon found her at the wagon after his rounds. She had been expecting him, in the way she'd come to expect his evening appearances. Not with certainty, but with a kind of readiness. He didn't sit this time. He stood near the wagon with his arms crossed, managing the ribs in the particular way he'd been managing them for 10 days, and he looked at her directly. "I meant what I said," he told her. "In case you've been wondering whether it was the circumstances, the fire, or... I want you to know it wasn't. I've been thinking about it since before that." She leaned against the wagon side. Her shoulder still ached in cold air, probably would for weeks. Her hand had healed most of the way. The scars settled into something permanent and slightly shiny along the old burn line. She was different from the woman who had packed one bag in Wichita, not in ways that were visible, but in ways that she could feel. She had been filed down and re-edged by 10 weeks of this, and she was not sure if that made her harder or just more accurately herself. "I know it wasn't the circumstances," she said. "I know you well enough by now to know that." "Then what are you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment, not stalling, actually thinking, the way the question deserved. "I'm thinking that I'm 20 years old," she said, "and I've been a widow for 7 months. And I don't know your children, and you don't know all of me either, despite what 10 weeks might suggest. I'm thinking that I'm not an easy person to live with. I'm exacting, and I get quiet when things are wrong, and I don't ask for help readily, and those are real things, not warnings I'm issuing to seem modest." "I know those things," he said. "I've been watching for 10 weeks. Watching isn't the same as living with." "No," he agreed. "It's not." "And your children—" "I know." He unfolded his arms carefully. "I'm not asking you to walk into a ready-made life. I know it's not that. I know Clara is... She's going to make it hard. Not deliberately. She's 7. But she's going to make it hard because she's been without her mother for over a year and she doesn't know how to talk about it, and she's taken that out on everyone who's come near the house. Including me." He paused. "I'm telling you that plainly because you deserve to know it plainly." She looked at him. A man who told the truth about his 7-year-old's grief without making it soft or manageable, without selling her an easy version of his life. That mattered to her in a way that was hard to articulate but was not hard to feel. "I'm going to say yes," she said, "not as a final answer tonight, but I want you to know that's where I am." He held her gaze and something moved through his expression. Not relief exactly, but something in that direction, something that had weight behind it. "All right," he said, "that's enough for now." He said goodnight and walked away in the careful, managed way he'd been walking for 10 days. And she watched him go and thought about Montana, which she had never seen, and about a 7-year-old girl named Clara who had put walls up around her grief and was going to make everything hard, and about a 9-year-old boy named Daniel who she knew nothing about yet, and about a ranch 40 miles northeast of Billings that was her potential future in a form she couldn't fully visualize. She thought about Thomas, briefly, the way she sometimes did at the end of days, Not with the sharp pain of the early months, but with the quieter acknowledgement of someone who had genuinely existed and mattered and was gone. She thought about the boarding house room with the window that didn't close and the $4.32 on the table, and the notice pinned outside the general store, and the decision she'd made standing in front of it before the sun was fully up. She had been trying to survive. That was all she'd been trying to do when she walked into the McReady stockyard and told Poole she knew how to feed large numbers of men under difficult conditions. What she had actually done, it turned out, was something considerably larger than survival. She was still working out exactly what to call it. The crew reached the Montana border the following afternoon. When they crossed it, an unmarked line in the landscape, no different on one side than the other, just land and sky. Walt said, "Montana," in his flat, informational way, and Cutter let out a sound that was somewhere between a whoop and a laugh, and several other men grinned or called out. And Lenora drove the supply wagon across the line with her left hand on the reins and her right hand resting in her lap, and looked at the country ahead of her. It was big. That was the dominant impression, bigger than anything she'd seen before, in a way that went beyond the measurements of it. Some quality in the landscape that made you feel the scale of the world in a way that was uncomfortable and extraordinary in roughly equal measure. She had come here with nothing. The night the drive delivered its cattle to the Billings stockyard, the crew received their wages. It was a practical transaction that took place in an office smelling of dust and old wood, each man filing through in turn. And Lenora waited her turn, the same as everyone else, and received her envelope and thanked the man behind the desk and walked out. She stood outside the office with the envelope in her hand. Gideon came out shortly after. The crew was dispersing into Billings in the various ways that men disperse after long drives. Toward saloons, toward hotels, toward the specific pleasures of ordinary life that only became visible after 10 weeks of their absence. They would not be a crew after tonight. They would just be individual men who had once done the same thing at the same time and would probably not all be in the same place again. He stood near her. The sun was going down over Billings, and the light was the particular amber that end-of-day light becomes in open country. And she was aware of how tired she was, genuinely, to the bottom of herself, and also of the fact that she was here, standing in Montana with her wages in her hand, which was something she had not been certain was going to happen when she'd started. "The hotel on the main street takes respectable travelers," he said. "I've arranged a room for you, if you want it, while you're thinking." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steadiness that she had come to think of as the most him thing about him, that quality of absolute presence, of being completely where he was without reservation or deflection. "I'll be riding out to the ranch tomorrow morning," he said, "to see the children. If you wanted to come, not as an answer, just to see." She thought about it for a moment. She had her wages. She had, for the first time in 7 months, options, actual options, not just the single door that had been open in Wichita. She could go south. She could find another position in Billings. She could do 100 things that weren't riding out to a ranch 40 miles northeast to meet 2 children who didn't know her. "What time?" she said. Something crossed his face. "Sunrise." "I'll be ready," she said. Inside the office behind them, the last of the crew was collecting his wages. Somewhere in the town a dog barked and went quiet. The amber light moved across the street, and the buildings and settled into the long shadows of evening. And the drive was over, and whatever came next was not the drive anymore. It was something else. Something she didn't have a name for yet, on the other side of a line as unmarked as the Montana border, where one kind of landscape ended and another began. She was ready before sunrise. This was not unusual for her. She had been waking before the camp for 10 weeks, and the habit had embedded itself in her body at a level below conscious choice. But standing in the doorway of the Billings hotel room in actual shoes rather than trail boots, in the one dress she'd packed that wasn't work clothing, she was aware of a different quality to the early morning. The room had a real bed, which she had slept in for the first time in over 2 months, and she had not slept well in it. Too soft, too still. No sound of cattle in the distance, no wind against a canvas wagon side. She had lain awake for a long time in the quiet of it and thought about sunrise. Gideon was at the front of the hotel with 2 horses when she came down. He looked rested in the way that competent people look, rested even when they aren't. Pulled together, present, the ribs still costing him something in the careful way he moved, but not slowing him in any way he would acknowledge. He looked at her in the dress and didn't make any remark about it, which she appreciated. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." They rode out of Billings as the sky was going from dark to gray, and she settled into the rhythm of the horse with the ease of someone who had spent 10 weeks around animals and had made her own uneasy peace with riding somewhere around week 4 of the drive. The country northeast of town was different from anything they'd crossed on the trail. Hills with timber on them, real timber, stands of pine and fir that broke the endlessness of the open grass and made the landscape feel more particular, more like somewhere rather than just somewhere to cross. She noticed it without commenting on it. She was thinking about other things. "Tell me about Daniel," she said, after they'd been riding for a while. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He's 9. Serious, reads anything he can get his hands on, which out here is not as much as he'd like. He's good with the horses, better than I was at his age." A pause. "He's been trying to be helpful since Margaret died, in the way that children try to be helpful when they're scared, doing things they think are expected rather than things that are actually needed. His aunt has been telling him he's the man of the house. I've told her to stop saying that." She absorbed this. "And Clara?" "Clara is 7, and she is angry," he said simply. "She doesn't have a name for it, and she doesn't have anywhere to put it, and she has been putting it on everyone who comes near her. She sent 2 of my sister's helpers home in tears inside of 6 months. He glanced at her. "I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling you so that when she's unkind to you, you don't think it's about you. I know it won't be about me. Knowing it and feeling it are different things." "Yes," she said, "they are." They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, which had always been comfortable between them, one of the things she'd noticed earliest and valued most. People who needed to fill silence were exhausting to be around. Gideon Mercer had never once in 10 weeks said something simply to occupy space, and she found this, more than almost any other quality, to be the thing she trusted most about him. The ranch appeared over a long rise, and she saw it first as a collection of shapes against the morning, a main house, a barn, outbuildings, fencing running out in several directions, and beyond it the long open sweep of grazing land that explained why this particular piece of country had been worth the 10-week drive to finance. It was not a beautiful ranch in any ornamental sense. It was a working ranch, which meant it was functional and weathered and carried its use visibly in every board and fence post, and she thought it was one of the most honest-looking places she had ever seen. A woman came out of the house as they rode in. Gideon's sister Ruth, who was 10 years older than him and shared his directness without sharing his containment. She had an open, evaluating face that made no secret of its assessment process, and she looked at Lenora with the specific attention of someone who has been managing a complicated situation in someone else's absence and wants to know whether the person now arriving is going to make that situation better or worse. "Ruth," Gideon said, dismounting carefully. "You look like something rode over you," Ruth said, looking at his ribs without him needing to explain them. Then she looked at Lenora. "You must be Mrs. Ashby." "Yes," Lenora said, and dismounted. "Thank you for what you've been doing here." Ruth absorbed this briefly. "The children are inside. Daniel knows you're coming. Clara—" She stopped. Revised. "Clara knows a woman is coming with her father. She has had opinions about this." "I imagine she might," Lenora said. Ruth looked at her for another moment, the evaluation continuing, and then she said, "Come inside," in the tone of someone who has made a preliminary decision that things might be all right. Daniel was at the kitchen table with a book, which he closed when they came in with the automatic guilt of a child who has been told to do something other than read and hasn't done it. He had Gideon's coloring and Margaret's eyes, probably. She didn't know what Margaret looked like, but there was something in his face that didn't fully match his father, a softer quality around the eyes. He stood up when Gideon came in, which was the man-of-the-house instinct Ruth had installed in him, and Gideon crossed to him and put a hand on his shoulder, and the boy leaned into it fractionally, almost without meaning to. "This is Mrs. Ashby," Gideon said. "She worked the drive with me." Daniel looked at her with 9-year-old directness. Aunt Ruth said you were the cook. I was. She said you saved my father's life. Lenora glanced at Gideon, who had clearly not told Ruth to keep this information contained. He looked mildly resigned. There were circumstances, she said. Your father would have managed. She's being modest, Gideon said to Daniel. She stood between me and a stampede with a bullwhip. Daniel stared at her. The book was entirely forgotten. With a bullwhip, he repeated. I wasn't skilled with it, she said honestly. I'd watched others use them and I'd never actually done it. It was mostly loud and I was loud alongside it, and together we apparently created enough disruption. Daniel sat back down without appearing to realize he'd done it. Did you get hurt? Some bruising. My hand. She showed him the scar briefly. The healed burn, the edge that had reopened and re-healed. He looked at it with the serious scientific attention of a boy who is both horrified and fascinated. Does it hurt now? Not much. Cold mornings. He nodded, looked at his father, back at her. Are you going to stay? Gideon said, That's something we're discussing. Oh, Daniel said, and picked up his book, and she could see him thinking about it behind the reading. Not reading, just holding the book while he thought. Clara did not come down for breakfast. Ruth said, with the particular flatness of someone who has been managing this pattern for months, that Clara would come when she was ready and not a moment before, and that attempting to hasten this process had never once in 7 months produced a useful result. Lenora said she understood, and she did. She spent the morning with Ruth, learning the house, not being given a tour exactly, but the natural absorption of information that happens when two practical women occupy the same space and begin to understand how each other thinks. Ruth showed her where things were kept without making an occasion of showing her, and Lenora paid attention without making an occasion of paying attention, and by noon they had established a working rhythm in the kitchen that felt, if not natural, then at least possible. She was good, Margaret, Ruth said during a quiet interval, not looking at Lenora, looking at the pot she was stirring. She kept everything very orderly. The children had a structure, a routine. When she died, it all... A pause. You can't replicate a person. I want you to know I know that. I haven't been trying to replicate her, and I'd suggest you don't either. I wasn't planning to, Lenora said. Ruth looked at her sideways. Good. Another pause. Clara has her mother's eyes. She knows she has her mother's eyes, and she has decided this makes her the keeper of her mother's memory, which at 7 means mostly making life very difficult for anyone who threatens it. She stirred the pot. She's not a bad child. She's a child who was handed a loss that was too large for her and wasn't given adequate tools. What tools does she have? Ruth considered this seriously. Silence, anger, and a genuine stubbornness that she did not get from Margaret. Lenora thought she understood where that came from. She kept the thought to herself. Clara appeared at lunch. She came down the stairs while the meal was being put on the table, which Lenora suspected was calculated. The child had been listening to the household sounds from upstairs and had timed her arrival for a moment when the table activity would make it awkward for anyone to make her entrance into something. She was small and dark-haired and had the particular posture of a child who has decided in advance to find everything disappointing. She took her seat without looking at Lenora directly. Gideon said, Clara, this is Mrs. Ashby. Clara looked at her plate. Hello, she said, with the flattest possible intonation. Hello, Clara, Lenora said, and didn't add anything, and served herself from the dish nearest to her and began to eat. Clara looked up. Briefly, just a flicker, a glance, checking whether the expected conversation was going to begin. The questions, the overtures, the adult attempts to make her feel comfortable that she found so easy to defeat. Lenora was looking at her food and eating it. Clara looked back at her plate. It was not a breakthrough. It was not anything on the surface. But Lenora had been around children enough to understand that not pressing was its own strategy and not a passive one. It required more discipline than pressing did, more willingness to let something develop at its own pace rather than at the pace you needed it to move. The days that followed were not easy. This was what Gideon had told her, and he was right, and knowing it in advance helped only partially. She was staying at the ranch. This had been decided without anyone formally deciding it. in the way that things sometimes settle when the practical circumstances point so clearly in one direction that discussion becomes unnecessary. She had a small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage, and which Ruth had cleared while Lenora and Gideon were still discussing whether she would come at all. When Lenora noticed this, she understood it as Ruth's own particular form of declaration, which was the form of just doing the thing rather than asking about it. They set a date for the wedding 3 weeks after arriving at the ranch, a date far enough out to be reasonable and close enough to be real. Ruth handled the small practical arrangements that a wedding in that time and place required, which were not many. A visiting minister was expected through the county the following month, and the neighbors who knew Gideon and had known Margaret would be invited, and that was essentially the shape of it. Clara behaved during these weeks in the way Ruth had described and Gideon had warned about. She was not cruel. The child didn't have cruelty in her, Lenora thought, which was important. But she was cold in the particular practiced way of someone who has discovered that coldness is a defensive structure. She answered direct questions directly and volunteered nothing. She did not resist Lenora's presence in the house, but she did not acknowledge it as welcome. She watched. Lenora watched back with patience and waited for the moment that would actually matter. It came 3 weeks before the wedding, on a night when the temperature dropped sharply and unexpectedly, and she woke at 2 a.m. to a sound she identified almost before she was fully awake, a child coughing, the specific deep cough that had a resonance she recognized from her first winter with Thomas. And she was out of the bed and in the hallway before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Clara's room. The cough was coming from Clara's room. She opened the door and the child was sitting up in the dark, coughing hard, her face in the thin light from the window clearly miserable. And when she saw Lenora in the doorway, the expression that crossed her face was not welcome, but it wasn't entirely the usual wall either. It was something more complicated. A child who was sick and who wanted someone and who resented the fact that the someone available was this particular person. Lenora crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on Clara's forehead. Fever. Not alarming, not yet, but real. "I'm going to get you something for the cough," she said, "and some water, and I'll build up the fire in here. The temperature dropped tonight." Clara said nothing. Lenora did what she'd said she'd do. She moved through it efficiently and without fuss, the way she'd moved through everything for the past months, the way she'd moved through everything for most of her life, probably. She heated the water, prepared what she had for the cough from the medicine supplies Ruth kept in the kitchen, built up the bedroom fire, and brought everything back and sat on the edge of the bed again and gave Clara the cup. The child drank, coughed again, less deeply. Lenora kept her hand near enough to steady the cup without making the steadying obvious. "My mother used to sit with me," Clara said when she'd finished drinking, not looking at Lenora, looking at the cup. It was the first unprompted thing she'd said to Lenora in 3 weeks. "I know," Lenora said. A long pause. "This isn't the same." "No," Lenora said. "It's not." Something shifted in the child's face. She had been braced for the reassurance, the adult attempt to bridge, to suggest equivalence, to put something in the place of something that couldn't be replaced. Lenora not saying that was apparently unexpected. "She made it with honey," Clara said, looking at the cup. "The cough medicine." "I don't have honey tonight. I'll get some tomorrow." Another pause, shorter. "Okay." Lenora sat until the cough had quieted and the child was lying back down, the fire warm in the room now, the immediate crisis managed. She stood up to go and Clara's hand came out from under the blanket and touched her wrist. Just touched it, briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it's real, and then went back. Lenora stood still for a moment. Then she pulled the blanket up slightly and walked out and closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway in the dark and felt the specific weight of that small contact in her chest in a way that was too large to do anything with at 2 a.m. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. The wedding happened on a Tuesday in October, which was not a typically chosen day for such things, but it was the day the visiting minister was available, and they were not people who found the calendar of their lives particularly subject to custom. The neighbors came, 8 families in total, people who had known Gideon and Margaret, and who arrived looking at Lenora with the same evaluating quality Ruth had shown, and whom she met with the same directness she'd met everything on this frontier, straight-backed, clear-eyed, not performing warmth, but not withholding it either. Daniel stood next to his father during the ceremony with the seriousness that was his baseline mode, and at some point during it, she saw him look at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something evaluating, and something hopeful, and something that was neither. Something that was just a 9-year-old boy who had decided, provisionally and with reservations he was not yet willing to fully set down, that things might be going to be all right. Clara stood next to Ruth. She was in her good dress, which was the same color as her eyes, and she watched the whole ceremony without expression, and when it was over she went inside before anyone else, and Lenora let her go. There would be time. That was the whole point of being here. That now there was time, and she intended to use every piece of it. The first Montana winter was exactly what Gideon had said it was. Serious. The word hadn't fully communicated the reality, which was that serious was the mild version. That the winters in this part of the territory had a weight and a duration that required a different kind of preparation than anything she'd experienced before. A recalibration of what endurance meant, and what the body could sustain, and how long a dark cold January could actually be when the land around you was white in every direction and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. She had been afraid of the winter. She hadn't said so, but she had been. She managed it the same way she'd managed everything else, by paying attention to what was required before it became urgent, by preparing where she could prepare and adapting where she couldn't, by getting up in the mornings when getting up was very hard, and starting the fire and starting the day, because the day required it, and she was not someone who asked the day to wait for her. The illness came in February. It came the way illness comes to families in hard winters, quietly and then all at once. Daniel had a cold that became something more, settled into his chest with a depth that kept him in bed for a week, and then 10 days, and then 2 weeks. And the thin sound of his breathing in the nights became the thing she fell asleep listening for, and woke up listening for and listened for during the day while she was doing everything else. She sat with him through it. This was not a decision. It was just what she did. She sat with him through the long nights when the fever was high, and brought the water and the medicine and changed the compresses, and talked to him when he was awake enough to be talked to, and sat quietly when he wasn't. She told him about the drive, about the storms and the creek crossing and the cracked pot and the coffee that ran out on day 8. And he listened with the specific attention of a sick child to whom a story is an anchor, something to hold on to while the body does its difficult work. Gideon came to sit with him in the nights, too, when he wasn't needed in the barn or elsewhere, and they sat on opposite sides of the boy's bed and took turns talking and being quiet and keeping the fire right. And something happened in those nights that was different from the drive and different from the first weeks at the ranch. Something that came from having been in the same room through genuine fear, the fear that lives under your skin and doesn't announce itself but is simply there, the fear that a child might not be all right. Daniel was all right. It took 3 weeks, and the last of it was slow. But he came back, ate real food, sat up, complained about being in bed, which was such a clear sign of recovery that she felt her shoulders come down from where they'd been for 3 weeks, and realized only then how high they'd been. Clara came to her the night after Daniel's fever finally broke. She came to the kitchen where Lenora was sitting by the stove at midnight, too tired to go to bed and too relieved to sleep anyway, and she sat down at the table across from her without saying anything for a long time. Lenora poured her a cup of warm milk, which Clara accepted, and they sat. "Were you scared?" Clara asked, "when Daniel was sick?" "Yes," Lenora said. "Very." Clara held the cup in both hands the way she did, looking at the surface of it. "I was scared too." "I know you were." "I didn't want to be scared at the same time as you," Clara said. This was said with the honesty that children have before they learn to perform their feelings into more acceptable shapes. Raw, precise, exactly what it was. Because then it would be like we were both scared together, and that would be... She stopped. Lenora waited. "I didn't want to need you," Clara said finally. "Because if I need you, then you can leave, and then it would be worse than if I didn't need you." The directness of it, the pure 7-year-old logic of self-protection, landed somewhere in Lenora's chest and stayed there. "I understand that," she said. That makes a lot of sense. Clara looked up. She'd expected, again, the adult refutation, so the reassurances about leaving and permanence, and the language adults used when they wanted to make fear go away without actually addressing it. It's a real risk, Lenore said. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. People you count on can go. Your mother went. That was real. And it was not fair. And it changed things that shouldn't have had to change. She paused. But the alternative to needing someone is not needing anyone. And I've tried that. I tried it for 7 months after my husband died, and it kept me alive, and it was also one of the loneliest things I've ever done. Clara was very still. I think needing people is the risk that makes the rest of it possible, Lenore said. I think it's the cost of having anyone at all. I can't promise you I'll always be here because nobody can honestly say that. But I can tell you that I intend to be here for a very long time and that I don't leave things I've decided to stay for. A long silence. Outside, the wind moved against the house in the particular language of Montana winter, and the stove ticked with its heat, and the milk cooled in the cups on the table. Mama used to put her hair in 2 braids at night, Clara said, not connected to what they'd been saying, or connected in the way that children connect things, sideways through association rather than logic. I don't know how to do 2 braids by myself. Ruth only knows 1. Lenora looked at her. I know how to do 2 braids. Clara looked at her cup. Okay, she said. It was not forgiveness, and it was not a rival, and it was not the end of anything. Clara would still be difficult on the bad days, still go quiet in ways that closed a door you hadn't realized was open, still put the wall up sometimes when Lenora got too close too quickly. These things did not stop. They became less frequent and less sustained, and the wall, when it went up, came down faster. That was the truth of it. Not that the damage healed cleanly, but that it healed the way real damage heals, unevenly and slowly and with setbacks. And that being present for the setbacks was part of what staying meant. In April, when the snow had retreated enough that the world began to look like itself again, Clara came to find her one morning in the garden where she'd started to turn the soil for planting. She stood at the garden edge and watched for a while, and then came in and crouched down and picked up a handful of dirt and turned it in her fingers the way she'd seen Lenora do, and said, "Can I help?" "Yes," Lenore said. "Come here. I'll show you how deep." Daniel, by spring, had decided to teach her to identify birds by their calls, which was something he'd been studying from a book Ruth had brought him during the illness. He would appear beside her during the morning chores and say things like, "That one's a mountain bluebird," or, "Hear that? That's a pine grosbeak," with the tone of someone transmitting important information that he expected her to retain, which she did, because it mattered to him, and because she was genuinely interested, and because these were the moments that didn't announce themselves as important but were. Gideon watched all of this. He didn't comment on it. He was not given to commentary on emotional things, would probably take this quality with him to his grave. But she could see him watching, and she could see what the watching meant to him. The specific quality of relief that doesn't express itself as relief, but as a kind of quiet that's different from the usual kind. The quiet of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has felt it shift to a more manageable position without quite setting it down, because you don't set those weights down all the way, but you find a way to carry them that doesn't cost you everything. One evening in May, late, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, he said to her, "Thank you." She was mending. She looked up. "For what specifically?" "Clara braided her own hair today, both sides." He paused. "She said you taught her." "She taught herself. I just showed her once." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not how she tells it." She looked back at her mending. There was nothing to say to that wouldn't make too much of it, and making too much of things was not how either of them operated. So she kept her hands moving, and he sat across from her, and the evening settled around the house in the particular way Montana evenings settled, big and quiet and edged with the smell of coming summer. And this was the life. Not the dramatic version, not the version with clear beginnings and obvious endings, but the actual version, which was this. Ordinary evenings in a warm house, children asleep upstairs, work done and work waiting. A person across the room who was difficult in some ways and steady in the ways that mattered most. She had come onto the McReady stockyard with $4.32 and no future. She thought about that sometimes, not with the sentiment that wants to make it into a story, not with the kind of retrospective wonder that smooths out everything that had been hard and frightening and genuinely uncertain. She thought about it plainly. She had been 20 years old and out of options, and she had taken the only door that was open, and the door had led somewhere she couldn't have imagined from where she'd been standing. That wasn't luck, exactly. She'd done too much work for it to be luck. But it wasn't only her, either. It was Walt saying no to Cole Briggs in the specific flat voice that meant something, and Cutter holding the canvas in the wind, and Gideon handing her a tin of salve in the dark of a supply wagon during a rainstorm, and talking about a 7-year-old girl who had gone silent. It was Daniel and his bird calls, and Clara's hands learning to make 2 braids. It was the accumulated weight of all the small things that people do for each other when they decide, collectively or separately, that someone is worth showing up for. She had spent a long time believing that survival meant needing as little as possible from the world around you. She had believed this out of necessity, and she had been good at it, and it had kept her going through the worst of things. She understood now that it had also been the most expensive way to live, the cost not visible in the short term, but real, paid out in the particular loneliness of a person who has learned to need nothing and has therefore received nothing, who has been so busy making sure she could stand alone that she had never let anyone stand beside her. That was what the trail had actually given her. Not safety, not comfort, not even Gideon, though all of those things were part of it. It had given her the evidence, accumulated over 10 weeks in conditions that were too difficult for pretense, that she was someone worth standing beside, someone worth a short nod from Walt, a tin of salve in the dark, a child's hand touching her wrist at 2 in the morning. She had needed that evidence. She hadn't known how much until she'd had it. The house came alive by summer in a way that Gideon later told her it hadn't been since before Margaret got sick. Not all at once and not without its difficult moments, but consistently, in the direction of more rather than less. Daniel's laugh, which she'd rarely heard in the first months, began to appear more regularly and without the slightly startled quality it had carried at first, as though he was surprised to find it still in him. Clara still had her hard days, but they were surrounded by easier ones. And the easier ones were easier in a way that felt real rather than performed. Ruth came to dinner one Sunday in July and sat at the table and looked at the children and looked at Lenora and looked at the table itself. The food, the small cloth Daniel had put in the middle because he'd noticed Lenora did that and had started doing it himself, and said, "Well," in the tone of someone arriving at a conclusion they'd been working toward for a while. She didn't say what the conclusion was. She didn't need to. Lenora passed her the bread, and Ruth took it, and the meal continued, and outside the Montana summer pressed warm against the windows, and Daniel identified a bird call from somewhere in the yard, and Clara looked up and said, with the authority of someone who had been taught and was now teaching, "That's a western tanager. I know that one." Daniel looked at her with the expression of a 9-year-old who is genuinely surprised to be outperformed and is deciding whether to be annoyed or impressed. He settled on impressed, barely. "How do you know that one?" he said. "I've been paying attention," Clara said, and went back to her food. Lenora kept her eyes on her plate. Beside her, she could feel Gideon doing the same, and she knew without looking that he was managing the same thing she was. The feeling that was too full for the moment, that required containment, that was not for dinner conversation, but was real and present, and was the whole point of everything. This was the life they had built. Not from the materials of ease or luck or the particular grace that sometimes protects people from the worst of things. From the materials available, which were difficult and ordinary and imperfect, and theirs. She put her fork down for a moment and looked at the table. Daniel's cloth in the middle, the food she'd made, the people around it. And then she picked her fork back up and kept eating, because the meal was still going and there was more of it to be had. And she had learned, on a supply wagon crossing 10 weeks of hard country with a burned hand and $4 to her name, that you ate what was in front of you and you did not look away from anything that was good.